Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the 9th of April 2012, the podcast that finds last year's Easter eggs. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's take a pass over the news of the Bogus. It was actually known before the Iraq War began that the claims that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction were lies, as the website truthaboutwar.org documented. Now, the man who apparently originated those lies, who told the Bush administration what they wanted to hear, has come forward and confessed. Rafid Ahmed Alwan al-Janabi, known at the time as Curveball, not only admits his role in the lie, but does it with glee. When an interviewer for the BBC said to him, "We went to war in Iraq on a lie, and that lie was your lie," he replied, "Yes." This lie ended up costing over 100,000 lives and trillions of dollars, with other countries like the UK footing much of the bill. Janabi made drawings of what he claimed were mobile biological weapons labs. According to Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who brought in the team to do the graphics for the White House, they, quote, sexed up Janabi's drawings. And Wilkerson himself admits, quote, intelligence was being worked to fit around the policy. The big problem here is that this may have the side effect of letting the Bush administration off the hook. Wilkerson claims that Colin Powell was used, as if he didn't have any knowledge about what his own people were doing. At best, it's sheer incompetence. And if nothing else, if the military can't determine that the baseless assertions of a single informant are untrue, then how on earth could they protect any of us from real threats? But again, as the Truth About War site shows, the information that this was fabricated was publicly available before the Iraq War began. Just as publicly available information shows that Iran has no capacity to make a nuclear weapon in anything like the next 500 years, and that they have complied 100% with the UN Non-Proliferation Treaty. Yet the warmongers are still using it as an excuse to stir up fear, to lead us into yet another war based on yet more lies. When will we ever learn? Even after all our debunkings, we still hear people in countries with universal health care, or UHC, bragging about their healthcare system, including hideously long waiting lists that result in people's conditions becoming untreatable. They claim, falsely and wrongly, that Americans are left to die waiting for ambulances and basic emergency services when it is against the law to deny these services in the United States. But not, apparently, in UHC countries such as Sweden. Just ask the family of 22-year-old Jill Soderberg, who died because her repeated calls for an ambulance went denied. All through the night on the 19th and 20th of January, Soderberg was in her home desperately trying to get emergency services to respond to her pleas. She had chest pains and breathing problems, but her pleas for an ambulance were repeatedly denied. Why? According to her mother Annika, quote, the operator considered her to still be communicating verbally and decided that she didn't need an ambulance. Wait a minute, so the only way you can call for an ambulance in Sweden is if you can't talk? How are you even supposed to call for one to begin with? The Swedish Health Board criticized the emergency services, saying, quote, the woman clearly asked for help on 3 occasions and wanted an ambulance to be sent straight away in the 3rd call. The National Board of Health and Welfare finds it remarkable that the woman's suffering was ignored on the 2nd and 3rd calls, and that the option of sending an on-duty primary care physician or a duty nurse to the woman's home wasn't utilized because the instructions were lacking. According to the board's Andrea Bloomer, quote, health advisory services interpreted things as if she had some sort of stomach bug or other influenza, and recommended that she visit a clinic the next day. But in the call, it shows that she was gasping for air, had slurred speech, and chest pains. That's a strong indication that an ambulance should have been sent in the first instance. It's remarkable that she didn't get any help. So the board slammed the emergency services employees involved and made sure this kind of thing would never happen again, right? Wrong! Despite their criticisms, the board found no fault with the emergency services personnel. How much of a genius do you have to be to realize that you need to send an ambulance to someone who's gasping for air? And how much of an incompetent bureaucrat do you have to be to not find fault with someone who doesn't? And before you UHC apologists go harping on about how this is just one isolated incident, it isn't. Last summer, a 74-year-old Stockholm man was having a heart attack and had to wait 13 hours before emergency services finally sent an ambulance. He died the next day. Again, the health board criticized the nurses who took the calls, but failed to find fault or require any changes. A 12-year-old boy called the emergency line to report a fire and was accused of prank calling. The fire claimed the life of a 5-year-old child. A 17-year-old boy died after his parents drove him to the hospital, giving up on emergency services ever sending an ambulance. When questioned later, they said they didn't send an ambulance because they didn't think it was an emergency. A woman lost her boyfriend when her calls to Sweden's emergency services went likewise unheeded. And what happened? Emergency services didn't even answer the phone! Repeated calls from both a landline and a mobile phone went unanswered. Sometime later, they finally called her back and sent out an ambulance, but it was too late. I found it very easy to dig up these examples in just a couple of minutes. All this points to a real systematic problem with Sweden's healthcare system, but since it's managed by bureaucrats, trying to actually find fault and make a change is next to impossible. All of these instances were in the last year, and there are plenty more besides. If this kind of thing were going on in the U.S., the advocates of UHC would be singing them from the mountaintops and using them as an example of why we need a government-run system. But when it happens in a country with UHC, silence. Even in the country where it happens. Where is the outrage from Swedes about all of this? The emergency services in Sweden are 100% owned and managed by state health authorities. And you have to go to the state health authorities if you want to change the system. And people really don't see this as a problem? This is what happens when government is put in charge of things. It becomes a big bureaucratic mess with no one being held accountable. Is this really the kind of system we want for our healthcare in America? Back home, things are taking a turn for the surreal. Arizona is considering a bill that would make it, quote, unlawful for any person with intent to terrify, intimidate, threaten, harass, annoy, or offend to use any electronic or digital device and to use any obscene, lewd, or profane language or suggest any lewd or lascivious act or threaten to inflict physical harm to the person or property of any person. Geez, half the comments to my YouTube channel will be illegal. This legislation, House Bill 2549, would make such an act up to a Class 3 felony, which in Arizona carries a minimum sentence of 2.5 years. The bill isn't limited to one-on-one exchanges, but is worded generally enough to apply to public forums as well. If so much as profane language can make someone a felon, then how is this not a hideous violation of the First Amendment? Everyone has the right to free speech, even if other people find it offensive or are annoyed by it. It's bad enough when the FCC just fines people for it. Now Arizona wants to put them in jail. Remember, just annoy or offend is enough to make someone guilty of violating this law. What is up with Arizona's lawmakers? Here's hoping they all get voted out in November. One thing I want to know, would this make political campaigns illegal as well? And now it's time to weigh the gravity of this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And this is one I take no joy in giving out, since it's an individual I have liked and respected for years and had several very rational discussions with. But when Neil Purcell nominated YouTube user Concordance for his video, The Libertarian Argument, I was forced to agree. For although there are many videos out there with far more bogus arguments against libertarianism, this one comes from someone who should know better.
This video is about the libertarian argument. This isn't a fallacy by itself. Personal freedom is a universally good thing. I just want to discuss when I find it particularly unconvincing as an argument. First, let's start with a case study. Imagine the presidential candidates are on their way to a conference together and the plane crash lands on a distant island. So they divide up the tasks. Let's say Romney is in charge of fishing, Newt the cooking and foraging, Santorum keeps watch for planes and ships, and Ron Paul is in charge of gathering firewood and maintaining the latrine and fire. Only Ron Paul decides he really doesn't want to do that.
And here we go right off the bat with a lifeboat scenario. This is something many libertarians have written about, describing a fallacy people have about libertarian thought. Its name comes from the following scenario. Two people are in a lifeboat. One of them takes out a drill to drill a hole in the bottom of the lifeboat. Does the other person have a right to use force to stop him? A similar scenario has someone on a sinking ship forcing his way onto a lifeboat and even forcing someone else out in the process. Concordance's island is the same way. It's a lifeboat scenario, and it's fallacious for the same reason. First, one should really question any kind of extreme or unlikely scenario being used against a philosophy. I mean, it's not like we have to come up with these kinds of extremes to criticize the state. The state is always quite willing to come up with real examples of its own that we can point to. So you could argue that even having to resort to such a scenario in the first place is a Godwin-esque admission of failure on the part of the critic. But it's fallacious for an even bigger reason as well. Libertarianism is not a philosophy of individual morality. It's a political philosophy. Libertarianism does not purport to say what kind of decisions people should make when dealing with each other one-on-one. It has to do with what governments should do as a matter of public policy. Individual libertarians have all sorts of different philosophies they use to try and guide themselves when making moral decisions in their everyday lives. Yes, some of them use philosophies consistent with libertarianism, such as Taoism or objectivism. But others use more mainstream approaches, such as Christian values. There are Jewish libertarians and Muslim libertarians, all using their religious beliefs to guide them in their everyday lives and just using libertarianism for questions of public policy. Still others use other philosophies, such as secular humanism. Libertarians consider what is immoral and what is illegal to be two different questions that may have very different answers. Libertarianism only comes into play when there is a government or some other institution of force that is attempting to enforce one particular decision from the top down, and in Concordance's scenario, like in all lifeboat scenarios, there is no such institution. In fact, unlike most other political philosophies, libertarianism does the exact opposite. It directly advocates, as much as can possibly be achieved, that people should be left alone to find their own solutions to the problems they face. In libertarianism, individuals are responsible for their own actions, and no matter what these islanders decide to do about the freeloader, it is in response to his own decision, and he must face the consequences of that decision. As Murray Rothbard wrote about lifeboat situations in Chapter 20 of The Ethics of Liberty, quote, "We are not, in constructing a theory of liberty and property, i.e. a political ethic, concerned with all personal moral principles. We are not herewith concerned with whether it is moral or immoral for someone to lie, to be a good person, to develop his faculties, or be kind or mean to his neighbors. We are concerned, in this sort of discussion, solely with such political ethical questions as the proper role of violence, the sphere of rights, or the definitions of criminality and aggression. Whether or not it is moral or immoral for the fellow excluded by the owner from the plank or the lifeboat to force someone else out of the lifeboat, or whether he should die heroically instead, is not our concern and not the proper concern of a theory of political ethics." It really is such a basic fallacy that it makes me wonder, despite Concordance's prior involvement with the Libertarian Party, if he ever really understood libertarian philosophy to begin with.
Let's redirect this scenario to the real world we all live in.
Which is what you should have done to begin with. Lifeboat scenarios get us nowhere.
Suppose that the community decides that the cost of smoking is too high.
Well, bully for the community.
They could completely outlaw it, and that would benefit the community.
Oh, it would? And how would they enforce this? A war on cigarettes? Has the war on drugs benefited our communities? Did alcohol prohibition benefit communities in the 1920s? Or did it just result in more crime, criminal gangs dealing in these substances, the users thrown in jail, and police raiding homes to see if drugs are there? Here, Concordance is making the false assumption that a smoking ban would actually stop people from smoking and ignoring the costs that come as a result of trying to enforce such a ban. And he should know better.
But at a cost to liberty of individual smokers.
And everybody else who now have to live in crime-ridden neighborhoods and worry about the police busting through their door on a mistaken cigarette raid.
Instead, we levy punitive taxes, the so-called sin taxes, to offset the cost to the society.
Yes, and those don't work any better, as can be seen by New York's cigarette tax. A report from a couple years ago showed that, in Albany alone, underground sales of cigarettes increased by 7.3 million packs per month, while legal sales plummeted 27%. Not even counting the number of people who simply drove across the border to buy cigarettes for themselves. And with it came the fraud and violence associated with criminal black market activities. The claim is that the extra tax revenue offsets the so-called externalities, but in reality, fewer people buy legal cigarettes and therefore don't pay the tax, meaning the revenue isn't coming in while people still get their smokes on the black market untaxed.
How is smoking harmful to society? What increases medical costs borne by the healthcare system?
Only if taxpayer money is being used to pay for it. In a free market system, this would be compensated for by the price mechanism. The smoker is forced to pay more for insurance and ends up with more out-of-pocket health expenses, and this, as Say's law shows, offsets the negative consequences to other healthcare consumers. And if we had something remotely resembling a free market healthcare system again, where healthcare costs could be covered by a mutual aid society, then these costs to individual smokers could be offset by membership in smoking clubs and other organizations that would exist that are now illegal to help them with these costs. It would even provide a greater incentive for people to quit smoking.
It decreases productivity, making a group less competitive.
Which in a free market would mean they're not paid as much for doing their work. Again, this would offset the negative consequences and provide yet another incentive to quit.
It creates an industry dedicated to promoting harmful behaviors.
No, the fact that people want to smoke creates the industry, and that industry, just like with drugs or alcohol, will exist regardless of how many laws you pass, or how many taxes you levy, or any other coercive measure you can think of for the government to do.
So we always have a tension between personal liberty and social costs.
This is a false choice, plain and simple. The assumption that laws will stop people from smoking, or that taxes will gain the revenues necessary to offset it, is simply fallacious, as history has shown over and over again. The only method proven to work is the price mechanism of the free market. It is the only thing that has ever been found to reliably compensate for the costs to others.
The U.S. Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, individual mandate. The U.S. takes a lot of flack from other countries for not having a robust public health care system.
We did before government started meddling in the 1960s.
President Obama made an effort to improve that situation.
No, he made an effort to do even more of what has failed for the last 40 years, harming the healthcare consumers so that his big corporate cronies can rake in even more profits, with greater protection from competitors.
When someone without insurance develops a serious illness, they typically go to an emergency room for care, and they enter the system without any way to pay for that care. That usually results in a cost being passed to other users of the facility, or to the healthcare system in general.
And once again, I have to mention that, before government meddling, free clinics and charity hospitals were everywhere. And these operated not by passing along the costs to others who paid more as a result, but from generous donors who voluntarily gave to these systems for that purpose. Of course, it was a lot easier back then because the relative lack of corporatism meant that healthcare was much cheaper. Ron Paul has told us several times of his experience in the early 1960s when his pay as a physician was only a few dollars an hour, and his hospital, Santa Rosa Hospital in San Antonio, took care of people who couldn't afford the services with money donated from the church that ran it. He himself treated many of his poor patrons for free, donating his own time and skill. Doctors even made house calls in those days. There were so many of them, and their pay was so low that this was just a part of doing business. But now, government licensing, with licensing boards stuffed with AMA members trying to keep doctors' pay as high as they can, limits the number of available physicians, causing a shortage. So now we pay more money for doctors to spend less time with us and see fewer patients. This is exacerbated, of course, by the hideous amount of state and federal regulations which require them to spend more time filling out paperwork than they do seeing patients. There used to be hundreds of Shriners hospitals around the country, with its heyday in the 1950s and early 60s. They not only served the poor, they worked to decrease waiting lists and played a large role in stopping polio by providing free vaccines. They were among the first to keep patient records in a computer database, which was a boon to clinical research. They even began to specialize, opening burn care units. But then, as costs rose and their legal options dwindled, they started to go away. They limited themselves to being children's hospitals, and despite a big push for expansion in the 1980s, Shriners hospitals closed down. Today, there are only 22 left in the country, and they're taking insurance for the first time ever to try and offset even greater costs. Government does not help alleviate excess costs. It causes excess costs far more than any free market forces would ever do.
Some states, but not all, require that motorcycle or bicycle riders wear protective headgear. This again represents a trade-off position. The cost to personal liberty is that you can be fined or jailed for your risky behavior. The cost to society can be measured in insurance premium increases, as any motorist involved in an accident with a bike rider has a higher chance of being judged responsible for a fatality.
But like smokers, the extra premium on their insurance gives them an incentive to use the helmets on their own, no law required. And if they don't, they're the ones who pay. At least in a free market that doesn't try to socialize the costs of everything.
When the community legislates safety laws, whether they be about cell phone use while driving, seatbelt laws, or mandatory fire inspections, those laws are about preventing people from making risky decisions that affect the rest of the community.
Except that none of these measures actually work. Banning cell phones while driving has never been shown to improve accidents or fatalities in real-world driving scenarios. Same with seatbelts, fire inspections, or anything else you might find. But all of these increase costs to everybody, because now new money has to be brought in the form of tax revenues, there's increased hassle as drivers are stopped for seatbelt checks, and they all open the door for bureaucrats to expand on these way beyond what anyone ever intended. Who would have thought in 2003, when the TSA was moved to the Department of Homeland Security, that they would end up, without any congressional action, banning things such as small bottles of water or soda, or forcing you to either submit to a genital pat-down or have a full nude body scan taken? These make us less secure, increase taxes and hassles at airports, hideously infringe on our basic liberties, and are completely unjustified. Yet Concordance apparently wants us to have to put up with all of this because some people won't wear a helmet.
That's not to say that we have to follow the slippery slope to every person being forbidden to take the slightest risk.
But where's the line drawn? And who's going to draw it? Not Concordance, no matter how reasonable he might be about where he thinks it should be drawn. It'll be drawn by some politician, or even worse, some unelected, unaccountable bureaucrat who'll base it on where he thinks it should be.
Instead, we try to strike a balance between what's fair for the individual and also fair for the community.
Except that government just does not work that way. It would be good for Concordance to familiarize himself with the political interest paradox, which shows that political interests have far more incentive to lobby for legislation and regulations that benefit them than the rest of us do to lobby against it. Once again, Concordance just isn't looking at all of the costs of his solution, which should be done in any cost-benefit analysis. Here's the fatal flaw with Concordance's thinking. He says that some people are going to behave irresponsibly and impose costs on society. He then says that we need government to fix that. But government is just people, nothing more. And so what happens when these people in the government behave irresponsibly, as they do pretty much every day of the year? At least in the free market you have accountability. But government all the time engages in irresponsible behavior, and very rarely do those responsible face any accountability for the costs they impose on the rest of us.
All it really means is a more complex cost-benefit analysis.
But apparently that's exactly what Concordance has been avoiding, which is sad, because he's a very intelligent, reasonable person who should know better. Yes, I'm holding him to a higher standard, but it's only because he set that standard for himself with almost 3 years of reasonable, well-thought-out videos. Maybe he needs a wake-up call when he shows the same kind of blind spot with the subject that he has pointed out in so many others, which is why I agree with Neil Purcell that Concordance should be this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And now it's time to bite the chocolate bunny ears off of this week's Idiot Extraprdinaire. The next time you hear someone claim we need state science standards to protect us from creationists, remember this story. The New York City Department of Education, because it might make children of young Earth creationist parents feel uncomfortable, has banned the word dinosaur from standardized tests. In addition to banning the word evolution, which has actually happened in several states across the country, they felt that the word dinosaur would be unpleasant for those whose backwards Bronze Age religion insists that the Earth is less than 10,000 years old, meaning that dinosaurs are either a trick by God to test our faith or the peaceful playmates of cave children. But those weren't the only words forbidden. Halloween was banned because it suggests paganism, even though it's a Christian holiday, the Feast of All Hallows Eve. Nice way to educate the children, New Yorkers. I wonder if anyone's ever told them that Easter was originally a pagan sex festival to worship the sex goddess Ishtar. They also banned the terms video game, rap music, and even dancing, although they did make an exception for ballet. It gets ridiculous. Poverty is banned because it might make poor children feel bad. Divorce, disease, alcohol, birthday, cancer, junk food, politics, slavery, and television are all verboten on these tests. And just how are they going to educate children on American history while avoiding a lot of these words, such as slavery? All in all, 50 such words are being banned, all in an attempt to appease more sensitive students and parents who have a problem with certain areas of reality. There was a time when schools actually taught people, which often means having to deal with the uncomfortable feeling of having something you thought you knew challenged. That's what school is for, but bring politics in, and it all becomes politically correct. And stuff like this happens. Stuff so ridiculous that it results in the New York City Department of Education being this week's Idiot Extraprdinaire. Well, that wraps up this Too Cool for School, Pity the Fool, Wipe Up Your Drool, Stubborn Old Mule, Lord of Misrule, Paula Abdul, Ran Out of Fuel, James Prescott Jewel, Put Down the Tool, and Get Out of the Pool edition of the Bogosity podcast. Please visit the forums of Bogosity.tv, where you can read the show notes and join the discussion on these and other subjects. This podcast is free, but not free to produce, so please use the donate button at the top of the Bogosity.tv website or down the right-hand side of the podcast page, and give generously to keep this podcast going. And if you'd like to contribute to the podcast, just send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@Bogosity.tv. Put it in an audio file, and if it's good enough, it'll get played right in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from John Alexander Smith. Nothing that you learn in the course of your studies will be the slightest possible use to you in afterlife, save only this, that if you work hard and intelligently, you should be able to detect when a man is talking rot. And that, in my view, is the main, if not sole, purpose of education. The Bogosity podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative 3.0 Unported license.
Bogosity.